Hi, my name's Kim Guelphy, and in this mini lecture we'll be focusing on stress. More specifically, we're going to be considering what exactly is stress and how does it affect our body, both in positive ways and negative ways. We'll also consider how prevalent stress is in our community, and we'll finish up this mini lecture by completing a brief questionnaire in order to identify what our current stress levels are. So first of all, what exactly is stress? Now, there are a number of different definitions of stress, but in its most simplest form, it can be considered a response of the body to the demands placed upon it. A slightly more detailed definition would be considering stress as a process by which we perceive and respond to stimuli or events that we consider to be a threat or a challenge to us. And stress can be acute or chronic in nature. In terms of acute stress, we're talking about demands and pressures of the present, or can even be the recent past or anticipated demands coming up in the very near future. Whereas chronic stress relates to extended periods of time where we feel unrelenting pressure of our day-to-day life. So acute and chronic stress can have different effects on the body, and we'll consider this in a bit more detail soon. So what actually happens when we feel stressed? What is the stress response? When we perceive stress, our nervous system senses this, and the brain sends a signal to the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland then releases a hormone, ACTH. Now, this stands for adrenocorticotropic hormone. Now, when ACTH is released in response to stress, it's released into the bloodstream where it can travel around to a number of areas in the body, but in particular, it targets the adrenal glands. And when ACTH reaches the adrenal glands, this causes the release of a number of stress hormones, in particular, cortisol, epinephrine, and norepinephrine. Now, you might have heard of epinephrine and norepinephrine using different terms. So another word for epinephrine is adrenaline, and another word for norepinephrine is noradrenaline. They're the same thing, okay? I'll be using the terms epinephrine and norepinephrine though. So these are stress hormones, and when they're released by the adrenal glands, they travel through the bloodstream and target cells throughout the entire body. And basically, what these hormones do is prepare us for action. They prepare us to respond to stress because stress is seen as a threat that we need to respond to. So it basically prepares the body for fight or flight. So what this means is the cortisol, the epinephrine and the norepinephrine coursing through our blood causes our hearing ability to increase. We get more blood flow to our brain. Our pupils dilate, so we get in more light. We can start to sweat a little bit. You've probably noticed yourself when you're stressed that your breathing rate increases, as well as getting an increase in your heart rate and your blood pressure. But also, what that cortisol, epinephrine and norepinephrine does is release stored fuel so that it's there ready for action. So the liver and fat tissues release energy producing substances, so basically the liver produces glucose, for example, releases this in the bloodstream so it's there ready for action. The digestive system sort of shuts down and slows blood supply to the GI tract because instead blood wants to be diverted to more critical areas like the brain and the muscles to be ready for action. So that's often why when you do feel stressed or particularly anxious, you can get some effects on your digestive system. Other effects include a decrease in urine production. As I mentioned before, you get more blood flow to the muscles. Muscles also get tense and ready for action. The immune system activity can decrease, and that's why we can sometimes be more susceptible to sickness when we're stressed, and our blood clotting ability also increases. So you can see when we feel stress, the body responds by becoming primed for action. And look, this is in some ways a beneficial response because it means we're ready, we're ready to go. But depending on the nature of the stressor, it can actually be a bad thing. So just to explain a bit more what I mean here, in the past, the types of stresses that we would have been exposed to would have been, for example, being chased by an animal in the wild. So I'm thinking back to our ancestors years and years ago. So you're in the jungle, a lion is in front of you, that's considered a stressor. The body responds by eliciting the stress response, so you're primed, ready to run for your life basically. So that's really beneficial in that instance. But then you think about today's society, we become stressed for completely different reasons. And in fact, most of the reasons for our stress today don't necessarily require these sorts of responses. And if we're chronically stressed, so stressed all the time, we have these responses, going on quite long term, and that's not a good thing either. So that brings me to considering the stress response curve. So what you see here is the stress response curve, or otherwise known as the Yerkes-Dodson curve. And what we have here is performance mapped against stress levels. And really what this figure is meant to represent is the fact that we need a little bit of stress in our lives. And in fact, to perform optimally, we definitely need some stress in our lives. The problem is when we have too much stress. So what we see down this end of the scale is no stress at all. When we have no stress, we're inactive and bored. Okay. In order to perform optimally, we do need a little bit of stress. But it's when we go past this point that we start to suffer some of the negative consequences of stress. So we start to feel fatigued, exhausted, and as we move further up the stress level here, we start to experience things like panic, anxiety and anger, and even burnout and breakdown. So this is when we start to see negative effects of stress on our health and well-being. Now, in terms of some of the effects of too much stress, most research to date has focused on the effects on the cardiovascular system. So we've just considered the stress response and how when we're acutely stressed we get this increase in sympathetic nervous system stimulation, which basically what that means is an increase in the epinephrine and the norepinephrine output. Now that in turn, as we mentioned on the previous slide, increases our heart rate and our blood pressure. It makes our blood vessels constrict. And those things in combination can be really bad for our heart health, particularly someone that's already got a little bit of underlying heart disease developing. The increase in heart rate and blood pressure combined with constriction of blood vessels puts a lot of pressure on the cardiovascular system. Now, in terms of other effects, when we have too much stress, as I mentioned before, we can have other effects on our heart. We start to clot our blood more easily and we increase our risk of having arrhythmias. We can injure the endothelial lining of our blood vessels. So all of the blood vessels throughout our body are lined by an endothelial layer. And this layer, when healthy, is protective for our health of our cardiovascular system, but it can be damaged. And when it's damaged or injured, that increases our risk of cardiovascular disease. I've already mentioned how when we're stressed, our blood can clot more easily as well, and that's not necessarily a good thing for our health. So look, in some ways that diagram might seem a little bit complex and overwhelming. So to put it in simpler terms, when we have too much stress, this has a negative effect on our cardiovascular health, so our heart health, because stress increases our blood pressure, increases overall strain on the heart, can damage our artery walls or our blood vessel walls, and overall this increases our long-term risk of cardiovascular disease. Now, that's emphasised in numerous research studies, some of which I think are quite interesting. So I just wanted to mention two examples here. So there was a study published a few years back that showed that on Mondays, when people go back to work after having potentially a nice relaxing weekend, there's a 33% increase in the number of cardiovascular events compared to a non-working population. Now the thing is, for a lot of people, work can be quite a big stress in life. And this study specifically showed that going back to work or returning to work on a Monday directly increases cardiovascular risk. Another interesting research study showed a few years back that there were more heart attacks during sporting events. Now this study specifically focused on the 2002 Soccer World Cup. And what they did in this study was they looked at ambulance records for call-outs for cardiovascular events. So we're mainly talking about heart attacks here, myocardial infarctions. And what they found was a 60% increase in emergency call-outs during the 2002 Soccer World Cup when compared to the same time of year in the same city the year prior. And they talked about in this study how people can be very passionate about their sport, and perhaps the stress and anxiety associated with any sort of tense game probably was associated with an increase in cardiovascular risk. Although you've also got to factor in, that a lot of people, when they are watching sport, they're probably not eating ideally as well. Plus, they're probably consuming alcohol. So I do think there's a few additional aspects of play here. But the idea behind me mentioning this study is just to show that stress, in any sense, can increase our risk of cardiovascular events. And I should mention that studies have shown similar phenomenon in looking at the AFL in Melbourne. So that's the effect of stress, particularly on our cardiovascular health. But stress has many more effects on the body as well. So I'm sure you can all relate to the fact that stress often has a negative impact on our healthy behaviours. So we know to keep healthy, we need to get plenty of sleep, we need to be physically active, we need to have a healthy diet, and ideally we want to avoid substance use in the form of alcohol and drugs. But when we're stressed, these are the things that often are the first thing to go out the window. So when we're stressed, we often have difficulty sleeping. Some people turn to substance use to help them deal with the stress. Often when we're stressed, it's when we actually need to be physically active, probably the most, but we tend to not. We tend to throw it out the window. And in terms of nutrition, I think the picture sums it up nicely. Stressed is dessert spelled backwards. So I'm sure most people can relate to the fact that when they feel stressed, if you had the choice between a nice shiny green apple versus, say, a chocolate bar or whatever it is, naughty treat wise that you like to eat, the apple just generally isn't going to cut it when we feel stressed. So stress can negatively impact our health in a number of ways, not just directly in terms of the effect on cardiovascular risk that I mentioned previously, but also through its impact on other healthy behaviours. Now that's of quite great concern because stress is really prevalent in our community. So recent surveys suggest that up to 75% of Australian adults report moderate to high levels of stress. So not low levels of stress, moderate to high levels of stress. And in terms of the impact this can have on our health, if we just look at one factor, so that is how stress might affect our eating habits, 75% of Australians also report that they turn to eating as a stress coping mechanism. And when I say eating, again, I'm not talking about eating that green apple. I'm talking about people eating unhealthy foods in order to help them cope with stress. And that's not good for our long-term health, particularly when we consider how prevalent stress is and that, we do encounter stress in our day-to-day lives. So to finish off this mini lecture, I want you to consider your own current stress levels. So the perceived stress scale is a 10-item questionnaire that's used quite commonly in order to identify how stressed an individual is. So I'm going to give you a few moments here, and I want you just to consider these 10 questions in relation to yourself. And specifically, I want you to consider how you've been feeling and thinking about things during the last month. So over the last month, I want you to consider, for example, how often have you been upset because of something that happened unexpectedly? And you either circle, 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4, with 4 being very often, 3 being fairly often, 2 being sometimes, 1 being almost never, and 0 being never. So perhaps if you answer that question, we'll go through each in turn, and I want you to record your responses. So question number 2, in the last month, how often have you felt that you were unable to control the important things in your life? Next, circle for yourself, in the last month, how often have you felt nervous and stressed? Question 4, in the last month, how often have you felt confident about your ability to handle your personal problems? In the last month, how often have you felt that things were going your way? In the last month, how often have you found that you could not cope with all the things that you had to do? In the last month, how often have you been able to control irritations in your life? In the last month, how often have you felt that you were on top of things? In the last month, how often have you been angered because of things that were outside your control? And finally, in the last month, how often have you felt difficulties were piling up so high that you could not overcome them? Now, in order to determine your score for this particular questionnaire, it is a matter of adding up your responses to each of the 10 questions. However, for items 4, 5, 7, and 8, you need to reverse score. So what that means is, for question 4 or item 4, if you circled 0, you actually get a score of 4. If you circled 1, you actually get a score of 3. So that's what it means when it says reverse score. So for items 4, 5, 7, and 8, you need to reverse score, and then you add up your total score for the 10 questions. So for anyone that needs a little bit of time to do that, perhaps you can just pause me here. And then when you come back to this lecture, you're probably going to be interested to know how your score compares to others. So the mean or average score for people aged between 18 and 29 years is a score of 14. And it's suggested that for people that are scoring higher than 15, that's a reasonable amount of stress. And so what we're going to talk about in our next mini lecture is how we can manage stress, so stress management techniques. In saying that though, for anyone that scored particularly high on this questionnaire that feels like they need to talk to someone, there are counselling services available free of charge through the university. So just to summarise today's lecture, we've considered what is stress and how stress can affect our body both in a positive sense and a negative sense. We've briefly considered the prevalence of stress in our community, and we've just finished up with a brief questionnaire to identify our own current stress levels. And as I said, in our next mini lecture, we'll consider what can we actually do about stress.